The year was 1944, and a deceptive silence had fallen over the Ardennes forest. To the Allied High Command, the dense, jagged terrain of eastern Belgium and Luxembourg was a quiet sector, a place where exhausted divisions went to recuperate and green units were bloodied. The war, according to the prevailing wisdom in Paris and London, was essentially won. The German Wehrmacht was a broken beast, retreating behind the west wall, starved of fuel and bled white on the eastern front. This collective sense of overconfidence had created a dangerous vacuum of vigilance. Beneath the canopy of ancient oaks and evergreens, a different reality was taking shape. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated and divorced from the strategic realities of his generals, was preparing one final, seismic gamble. It was an operation born of desperation and fueled by a fanatic belief in the power of the will over the logic of steel. He called it Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. His objective was nothing less than the recapture of Antwerp, the vital port that fed the Allied machine. By slicing through the thin American lines, he hoped to trap for Allied armies and force a separate peace with the West. The German plan relied on two variables that were beyond their control, the weather and the speed of their advance. They needed heavy fog and low clouds to ground the overwhelming Allied air forces, and they needed to capture Allied fuel dumps to keep their thirsty panzers moving. It was a plan built on a foundation of sand, a systemic failure of military intelligence that ignored the logistical nightmare of moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through narrow, icy mountain passes in the dead of winter. On the morning of December 16, the silence of the Ardennes was shattered by the roar of 2,000 German guns. The barrage was so intense that American soldiers in their foxholes thought the very earth was being torn asunder. Out of the mist emerged the grey ghosts of the Volksgrenadiers and the terrifying silhouette of the King Tiger tanks. The surprise was total. Allied intelligence, lulled by their own successes and a misplaced belief that the Germans were incapable of a large-scale offensive, had ignored the warning signs. The systemic failure of the Allied command was not just a lack of information, but a failure of imagination. They could not conceive that an enemy so thoroughly beaten could muster the strength for such a blow. As the German spearheads punctured the thin American line, chaos became the order of the day. Communication lines were severed, command posts were overrun, and units found themselves isolated in a white hell of snow and fire. The ghost front had become a slaughterhouse. At the tip of the German spear was Kampfgruppe Paper, led by the fanatical SS commander Joachim Paper. His mission was to drive hard for the Meuse River, and he was prepared to do so with a ruthlessness that would leave a stain on the history of the war. Near the crossroads of Malmedy, Paper's men encountered a convoy of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. What followed was a cold-blooded massacre of over 80 American prisoners of war, a tactical disaster that would soon galvanize the American spirit rather than break it. While the world's eyes would eventually turn to the larger movements of armies, the true story of the Ardennes was being written by small groups of men holding lonely crossroads. At the town of St. Vith, a ragtag collection of units, including the 7th Armored Division, stood their ground against overwhelming odds. They delayed the German advance for days, upsetting the strict timetable of the offensive. These were the unsung heroes of the early days, men who fought and died in the freezing mud to buy the Allied command the one thing it lacked: time. As the German Bulge expanded, the strategic importance of a small market town named Bastogne became clear. Bastogne was the hub of 7 key roads in the region. If the Germans held it, they could fan out across the Belgian plains. If the Americans held it, the entire German offensive would be bottlenecked, its momentum strangled by a single point of resistance. The task of holding Bastogne fell to the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who were rushed to the front in open-top trucks, many without winter clothing or sufficient ammunition. By December 21st, the Germans had completely encircled the town. The 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, was trapped in a pocket that the Germans called the Hole in the Donut. The conditions were horrific. The temperature plummeted, and the men lived in frozen foxholes, their boots rotting and their limbs numbing. Medical supplies ran out, and surgeons were forced to operate in the basements of bombed-out buildings using cognac as an anesthetic. The German commander, sensing an easy victory, sent a formal demand for surrender to the American headquarters. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, looked at the paper and gave a response that would echo through history: nuts. It was a quintessentially American expression of defiance, a refusal to accept the inevitability of defeat even when surrounded by the elite of the German army. The siege of Bastogne was a microcosm of the entire conflict, a clash between a rigid, authoritarian military machine and the stubborn, individualistic resilience of the American soldier. While the Germans relied on their heavy armor and the terror of their reputation, the defenders of Bastogne relied on each other. The unsung heroes were the medics who crawled through minefields to reach the wounded, and the artillerymen who hoarded their last shells for the moments when the German tanks were clattering through the outskirts of the town. The tactical disaster for the Germans was not just their inability to take Bastogne, but their failure to account for the American capacity for rapid redeployment. General George S. Patton, in one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the war, turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees in the middle of a winter storm and raced north to relieve the besieged town. Patton's hubris was legendary, but his brilliance in movement was undeniable. He understood that in a war of attrition, speed and violence of action were the only cures for a breakthrough. On December 23, the miracle the Americans had prayed for finally arrived. The grey shroud of clouds lifted, and the sun began to glisten off the snow. For the German soldiers, the sight of clear blue skies was a death warrant. Within hours, thousands of Allied planes filled the air, turning the narrow roads of the Ardennes into a graveyard of burning German steel. The CA-47 transport planes began dropping supplies to the men in Bastogne, their parachutes blooming like flowers of hope over the frozen landscape. The tide had turned, but the tragedy was far from over. The final weeks of the Battle of the Bulge were a grueling, yard-by-yard slog through deep snow and hidden minefields. The German retreat was as bloody as their advance. Hitler, refusing to allow a tactical withdrawal, condemned thousands more of his men to die in a pocket that was rapidly shrinking. The systemic failure of the Nazi leadership was now complete. They were consuming their own youth in a fire that could no longer be sustained. When the lines were finally restored in late January 1945, the cost was staggering. Over 100,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured, the costliest battle in the history of the United States Army. The German losses were equally catastrophic, and more importantly, they were irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht had spent its last reserves of men, fuel, and morale in the Ardennes. The road to Berlin was now open, but it was paved with the bodies of those who had fought in the coldest winter in living memory. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a monumental testament to the irony of war. Hitler's attempt to split the Allies only served to cement their cooperation. His attempt to seize the initiative only accelerated his own destruction. It was a conflict defined by the failure of high-level strategy and the triumph of low-level grit. It proved that while generals may draw lines on maps, it is the soldier in the foxhole who determines where those lines actually fall. As we look back at the frozen forests of the Ardennes, we see more than just a military engagement. We see the final, desperate gasp of a dying regime, and the emergence of a new world order forged in the crucible of fire and ice. The philosophical takeaway of the Bulge is a sobering one, that even in the face of inevitable defeat, the human capacity for destruction remains vast, yet it is matched only by the human capacity for endurance and sacrifice. The echoes of the guns have long since faded, and the scars on the trees have healed. But in the quiet glades near Bastogne and Malmedy, the shadows of the past remain. They remind us that peace is a fragile thing, often bought at a price that defies calculation. The men who stood their ground in the winter of 1944 were not just fighting for a town or a road, they were fighting for the very idea that tyranny, no matter how powerful its machines or how fierce its will, can be broken by the quiet courage of those who refuse to surrender. The snow falls softly now over the monuments and the silent foxholes, a white shroud over a graveyard of empires. The Ardennes remains a place of pilgrimage, a cathedral of memory where the wind whispers the names of the lost. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was not won by a grand plan or a stroke of genius, but by the collective refusal of thousands of ordinary men to let the darkness win. And in that frozen landscape, the light of their sacrifice continues to burn, a flickering flame against the cold indifference of history.